Greetings, folks. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Dustin Cormier, and welcome to another episode of How to Rock Astrology. Today, I thought that I would make clear a little bit of an important topic that is happening all over the astrology world, and it's been happening for a lot longer than most people might think. This is the issue of the whole sign houses, as well as this plays into what we call in Vedic astrology or tropical Vedic astrology, the house lords. Now, I am a tropical Vedic astrologer. I don't turn the signs back 23 degrees like most sidereal astrologers do, but I practice ancient astrology. And it's at this point I should probably like to mention that, high five to my Hellenistic astrology friends, because they will often play into a lot of the things that we as tropical Vedic astrologers talk about, because we're both in the same, very much in a shared, what I would call a shared group. Hellenistic astrologers are practicing an ancient astrology, and they're using tropical measurements. Vedic astrologers are practicing with an ancient tradition, but they're using tropical methods. So, in particular, with this whole sign house system, which we see already in play in this first picture that I've got here, we're going to talk about this very important picture as we come along. Before we do, again, another shout out to the Hellenistic astrologers. I've recently watched a video, a wonderful video that I recommend. It is by Chris Brennan, and it is his video, The House Divisions in Ancient Astrology, the origins of the different systems. And in this video, he does a great job breaking down where do the different house systems come from. And he talks a lot about what we call the dynamic quadrant houses. Sorry, I'm going to show you what I mean in just a moment. So many of you might know about these quadrant houses that look a little bit like this. We can see that there's an uneven trisectional houses, the quadrant houses, right? Where there's this, for example, there can be big gaps in where the house cusps fall. And those are considered to be definitions for houses. You don't see that you really hardly see that in Vedic astrology. And Hellenistic astrology, being ancient, technically the Hellenistic people can use both, just like tropical Vedic can. But in this video, Chris Brennan describes that whole signs were the first thing that got done. And I really highly recommend his video on that. He goes into further depth in a video with his special guest Luis Rubiero entitled House Division Explained. It's another video that I highly recommend. In both of these videos, these gentlemen just do a wonderful job of digging into the roots of the houses and then explaining how modern sectional houses came to be. But of course, the basic beginning of it all was whole sign houses. Back in the day, there was a time when splitting up the houses was a very confusing thing. So what they would do is they would say, where's the horizon? And wherever the horizon is, that was the first house. The second sign is the second house. The third sign is the third house. The fourth sign is the fourth house. Wherever the planets fall in there. It's not quite the same as the equal house system, as we're going to mention. Now, people say that this was done, and partly it was done because it was simple. It was a simple way to understand the houses and to break down the astrological house system, because they wouldn't have to do the complex astronomical geometry necessary for the house cusps. And this brings up our important point that we're going to begin with today, which is that just because those ancient astrologers were using what we call a primordial system, such as whole sign house system, the whole sign houses were primitive because they came first. Just like drums are primitive. But just because drums came first doesn't mean that they are primitive in the sense that they are behind the times or that they're behind things. You know, the point that I got here is that drums and rhythm were the first thing that got discovered musically. Before we were singing, we were hitting stuff and we were drumming and just making rhythms, you know. Drumming and rhythm are still foundational to music today. So just because they were discovered first doesn't mean they're any less foundational. Music and rhythm is foundational to music. That's probably why it got discovered first. Whole sign houses are exactly the same way. Whole sign houses are similar in that they're foundational to all traditions of astrology. So you don't have to, drink my Kool-Aid here and ignore the other systems. Like, I'm not looking for your vote here. I'm not looking to steal you from these other systems. What I'm trying to get you to recognize is that there are things that you're missing out on with the whole sign house system. And it's especially in the Vedic system, we talk about house lords and house yogas. And these can only be understood once you peer past the mist of the modern house system. And we start to see this when we look at what's called the whole sign house system, where each planet is ruling basically one of the chakras, as you can see here. Now, you guys have probably seen this in many of my videos. The simple example here is for Leo rising. You can see the sun rules the first house and the moon rules the 12th. That's the Ajna chakra. Mercury, the throat chakra, rules the 11th and the 2nd. It's Gemini and Virgo. Venus rules the heart chakra, Taurus at the 10th, and then Libra at the 3rd house. The Scorpio, Mars rules the solar plexus, the yellow chakra, at the Aries and Scorpio. Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius. That's the Svadhisthana chakra. And then Saturn rules the root chakra. Now, this isn't just for Leo. This is for everybody. Leo just happens to have it, the Ajna chakra, at the rising sign. Each of these planets is a lord over not only this chakra, but, depending on the rising sign, each planet is a lord of the house that it rules. So a house lord is basically a dispositor of a sign. It's the planet that rules a sign. Except that, again, in this system, the lord is combined with the sign dispositor. So don't let this go over your head. It gets a little bit simpler as you delve into this work. And it's pretty easy to understand. And you have to understand that there is a lot of foundational things that you miss out on in the modern house system by skipping out on this. And let me just make the point here before we go on that you can include the house cusps into the whole sign house system. The house cusps are like Campanus, Placidus, Porphyry, Coke. You can use all of them in the whole sign house system. The whole sign houses will just be the base, the bottom foundation of it, as we're going to show you in just a moment on this next slide. Now, this is what we've seen in Vedic astrology. The point that I want to kind of share here is that these little blue numbers, the signs are represented by the squares. And you can have the house cusps falling into these signs. Now, this is how Vedic astrology has always done things. Vedic astrology fans have no trouble with this concept because the whole sign house system is embedded in the foundation of Vedic theory. You'll hear them talk about the house lords. You know, the simplest example, I'm going to bring up this Alan Watts chart here eventually. This is Kala. It's a Vedic astrology software, tropical Vedic. And we can see here in Kala that the little blue numbers represent the house cusps. But you'll notice that the little blue numbers are falling into the slices of this pizza, but the pizza is still cut into even portions of the signs. So the simplest example, this is a Sagittarius rising chart. Sagittarius rising has Jupiter ruling Sagittarius as the dispositor. We see Jupiter here is falling into Aquarius. That's considered the third sign from Sagittarius. So that's considered the first lord as falling into the third house. And there is a yoga associated with that. It's a first house energy falling into the third house and being combined together. A yoga is a uniting. That's what, any yoga people would know this. Yuj comes from the goad of an ox. It ties the ox to its cart so it can pull the cart. There's a very deep spiritual metaphor there. It's tying the spiritual body to the physical body. And that's why when we do yoga, we're uniting body, mind, and spirit. So yoga is a union. So when you hear in Vedic astrology a yoga, it's a union of two different things. In the case of these house yogas, we can have the first house lord, the dispositor of the first house, falling into any of the 12 houses. This is a foundational element which can still use the house cusps. As I said, in this chart of Alan Watts, this is a Campanus cusp chart that I'm using as this example, where that little number 2, the blue number 2 that's falling into Aquarius, is the second cusp. So however you want to define that second cusp, the second cusp in this chart, we can look at the cusps, and it falls around 0 degrees. The second house cusp falls around 14 degrees Aquarius. Now, this gives us all the different types of debates. Does this Jupiter fall into the third house, or does it fall into the second house because it's past the second house cusp? In our system, it is still considered to be in the third house, but it has second house qualities to it. This is what I'm trying to convey in this video. Already, if you've seen this, you get it. There's a whole world for you to unfurl by this. It's not negating the modern house system. It's adding something which has been taken away by the modern house system. And that is the foundational whole sign houses and the lords, the house yogas that can come from that. So let's dig in just a little bit more here to how this all works. So the whole sign houses is embedded in the foundation of all interpretations in Vedic astrology, and some would say in a lot of Hellenistic astrology too. So this is anciently regarded as the foundational method of chart interpretation. So this is why when you look at the North and South Indian charts, they have these unmoving house spaces. The signs don't move from there. And even in the North sign, the North Indian style, those are the signs and houses are combined as one. And you can still, in the North or the South, you can have house cusps falling into these little squares, or these which represent the signs in both the North and South chart style. Each of these sign spaces covers 30 degrees. So each house lord technically rules 0 to 30 degrees of each sign. And then you can insert house cusps into those spaces. So the whole sign houses are the presiding foundation for tropical Vedic astrology and for Hellenistic astrology. We do not rely on these uneven trisectional houses for our foundational house interpretation. Now this is exaggerated for emphasis. I've made this little chart where you can see this giant 11th house and this giant 5th house. right? That's the modern take. Now, we have to make a difference here. Whole sign houses is not the same as the equal house system. It's a big difference. The equal house system is basically where the 12th house lies directly behind the first house cusp. So in this little example, we can see this is a Cancer rising chart on the right here. Now, let's say the ascendant is at 15 degrees Cancer. Now, let's imagine that Mars falls at 6 degrees Cancer. In the equal house system, the houses are equally 30 degrees apart. So this Mars falling at 6 degrees Cancer is technically, in the equal house system, falls into the 12th house. Because anything behind the ascendant and in front of the 12th house cusp is considered the 12th house. This is not how we do it in whole sign astrology. In the whole sign house system, even when the ascendant falls at 29 degrees of a sign, a planet falling anywhere in that sign still falls in the first house. This Alan Watts chart is another great example. We see this is Alan Watts' chart. We have Venus here. So this is a Sagittarius rising. And Sagittarius rising, the rising sign falls at 18 degrees of Sagittarius in Alan Watts' chart. Now look at this Venus. It technically falls at 3 degrees. So by our, by the neo-tropical Vedic standard, or Hellenistic, we would say that this has a mixture of first house and 12th house energy. But the basic reading here is that this Venus is falling into the first house. That's why it's in the first slice of pizza, even though it's behind the ascendant, which falls at 18 degrees. So when we read about this Venus as its yoga, we would say, for example, Taurus rules the 6th house from Sagittarius. Libra rules the 11th house from Sagittarius. So this is the 11th house energy being poured into the first house from Libra. It's also the 6th house energy being poured into the first house from Taurus. We have the 6th lord in the first house, even though it's behind the ascendant. Right? So no matter what, no matter where this Venus falls in Sagittarius, it's going to be in the first whole sign house. And that's where that yoga will come from. Even though it has a bit of 12th house energy, we combine them both. So, in other words, the signs are the houses. And house cusps are only used to give extra incidental information related to planetary and sign strength. Again, you can find this exact same thing being echoed by Chris Brennan, as well as his friend, Luis Rubiero, talks about all of the house cusp system, but I digress. Chris Brennan, as a Hellenistic astrologer, really is bringing this forth. And of course, I can't forget to mention this video of Vic Dicara, Static versus Dynamic Houses, where he basically talks about this same thing as well through a very Vedic astrology way of explaining. The house cusps are only used to give extra incidental information. Has to do with Shadbala, has to do with other types of strength. But the main reading of a planet's energy is carrying its house. And this really even goes to show that in a chart like this Alan Watts chart, for example, we could really see the strength of, for example, this Saturn in the 7th house by observing what's going on with Mercury. The fact that this Mercury in Alan Watts' chart is combust shows a little bit of difficulty for the dispositor of the 7th house. So we could look at this yoga, we could say the 7th lord is falling in the 2nd house, and we could talk about some of the good associated with it and some of the bad, especially because this Mercury is combust with these two malefics here. we could definitely read some difficulty of having the 7th lord in the 2nd house. Some of the business energy being wrapped up in personal 2nd house psychology. Although it has its strengths too, as we know Alan Watts was good with psychology. So the signs are the houses, and the lords falling into the whole sign houses are foundational to all traditions. The house cusps just give extra information. Now this is especially foundational because it defines the whole sign house system, defines the lords of a rising sign. So this is a Pisces rising we have, right? You'll notice when you watch my rising sign series, and I do recommend it if you guys are interested in everything that you're listening to here. I have a series on my YouTube channel that you can go to, and you can see me discussing all of the rising signs. And I'm going to discuss exactly what we're talking about here in each of these rising sign videos, where, as you can see, once I get my thing here, this, for example, Pisces rising has better or worse relationships with each of these house lords. It especially has to do with the fact that the trines are always going to be friendly. That's auspicious, the green letter, but there's also inauspicious house lords. How a house lord functions for a rising sign depends on the houses it rules and its friendship or enemy with the rising sign lord. That's more Vedic stuff, just to give you a clue there. But this is us calling into, and again, high-fiving our Hellenistic friends for discussing how the original system of the whole sign houses came first, but that doesn't make it less meaningful. Modern pop astrology has made much ado about these uneven trisectional house divisions, such as Porphyry, Placidus, Campanus, equal houses, Koch, etc., etc. Chris Brennan calls them quadrant houses for various reasons, is that you're splitting the houses into these quadrants based on the angles, and the angles is what creates these uneven houses. Or, for example, an 11th house can be like, span between 4 different signs, right? This often happens, especially the further you get up north, in which case complications often happen with the house cusps. Astrologers these days just say, we don't know exactly what to do with it. It's kind of something that the ancients didn't account for. I'm just checking to see if you guys can see me here. But of course, the whole sign house people never had to worry too much about that because their foundation was whole sign. Modern pop astrology took precedence because the whole sign houses were discovered earlier. So it's considered more primitive to the modern pop model. And this is what I'm seeking to debunk in this video. So this is similar to what I said about the drums. Whole sign houses is the ancient foundation for all chart interpretation traditions for a reason. When we consider the major scale, it's primitive compared to other more complex modes and scales because it was discovered early. But that doesn't make the major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, do. I gotta get better at my singing. That do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do is foundational to music. That's why it was discovered earlier than the other modes. Now, contemporary modes are built off of this 8-note interval scale, not despite it. It's the same thing with modern divisions are built off of the whole sign houses. It's upon this whole sign house system that the Indian sages based their powerful interpretation method known as Pava yogas, or house lords, the house yogas. That's what I'm talking about. For example, if you take the planet that rules the 2nd house and you put it into another house, such as the 6th house, or in the case of our Alan Watts chart here, You can see for Sagittarius, Capricorn rules the second house. Saturn, rather, rules Capricorn, which rules the second house. I'm glad I used this chart because this even shows a great example of what we call a mutual house exchange, which is another type of union, a yoga. We see Saturn rules the second house, Capricorn, and it's falling in the 7th house of Gemini. Mercury rules Gemini, the 7th house, and Mercury is falling into the 2nd house of Capricorn. So there's a deep interplay of the 2nd and 7th house for Alan Watts. We can see the 2nd house, which is interested in gaining resources, gaining knowledge, gaining information, and speaking about it, and talking about it, and making it into some kind of business ploy that's shared with the world through the 7th house. If you know Alan Watts, he's kind of about that. So these are the yogas involved with house lords. Now, this is also highly relevant when you have the lord of one house interacting with the lord of another house, as we just saw. That's a mutual yoga, but there can be very many of these. You know, even looking at Alan Watts's chart, we have the Mars, Sun, and Mercury all conjunct, very closely conjunct in this chart. So all the houses that those planets rule are all being in a yoga. They're all coming together in the 2nd house, right? And this is a very clear, clean 2nd house energy. You know, it's the Jupiter that would have a mix of 2nd and 3rd house energy because it's in the 3rd house. It's in the 3rd sign, but it has the 2nd house cusp associated with it, right? This often happens in today's time. You got to read a bit of both. When you look at this Neptune and Pluto here, it's technically in the 8th sign from Sagittarius. That's Cancer, but it's behind the 8th house cusp. So it has a bit of a 7th house and 8th house energy, mainly 8th house. That's how we would interpret that Pluto and Neptune in Cancer, the 8th sign from Sagittarius, right? So this is how these things tend to operate in this system. Now, if you've followed me in Vedic astrology, you know that Rahu and Ketu are especially important, as well as the Jaimini Karakas and the outer planets acting through their houses and house lords is very highly relevant. Now, Western astrology could use this knowledge, but the uneven quadrant houses kind of messed up the whole sign houses thing. And now we're here to bring it back. The reason that modern Western astrologers don't tend to use the taking of the Lord, the dispositor, and considering that it's carrying all of the house cusps and planets that fall into it and bringing it into whatever house it's falling into, and a reading being relevant there. That is very much because the quadrant houses, I mean, technically we could say that it still uses these things. You know, Western astrologers use dispositors, but they don't put the same emphasis on it that the tropical Vedic and Hellenistic astrologers do. And this can really change a reading dramatically. Even a reading like this with this Alan Watts reading, we can see the 8th house cusp falls into 14 degrees of Leo. That 8th house cusp is falling into Leo. Now we see the south node, which is very important in Vedic astrology. The south node comes after the 8th house cusp. It's way before the 9th house cusp. So most Western astrologers would say that this south node is mainly interacting with the 8th house cusp. It has an 8th house energy. Now, because it's so close to the 8th house cusp, it's true, I would agree, that we could read the south node interacting with the 8th house cusp and with the 8th house. But even more than that, if I was reading for Alan Watts and if I was trying to talk with him about what's going on with his south node, I would read him as having the south node in the 9th house, because Leo is always the 9th house from Sagittarius. And you can kind of see this in this little thing here. So this is our Sagittarius rising. I've made it a little bit chunkier in this particular picture, but we see Sagittarius is the first house, Aries is the 5th house, Gemini is the 7th house, Leo is the 9th house. Leo is a friend because it's in the trine. So Leo rules the 9th house, which is the sun. The sun is a friend to Sagittarius. So this south node falling in the 9th house is not in the worst place, but that makes it difficult for the north node falling in Aquarius. Aquarius isn't the worst place for Sagittarius, but it's not as friendly as the south node. So people can often have more friendliness or enmity towards one node or the other. Alan Watts, we can certainly see, has a very 9th house south node. Sometimes it can be debated. Some people would say it's an 8th house energy, but I would say that's coming from Pluto and Neptune. So a lot of this stuff can just be, you know, everybody has to take whatever tradition they're learning from, digest it, and apply it with their experience, with consciousness as best they can. What I've wanted to do with this video is give everybody a sense of what you could be missing by using the whole sign house system, the house yogas, and by understanding that just because the whole sign house system came first doesn't mean it's not foundational to all traditions of astrology. I think the more people that come to understand this, it's going to be a great service to something that has been lost in the ancient astrology traditions because of this thing that has happened with the overemphasis, not an overemphasis, but not an overemphasis on modern trisectional houses, but an underemphasis of the whole sign system. We use both, but we have considered the whole sign system to be foundational. Not only that, but the whole sign system is there. Modern pop astrology has taken it out, and I challenge you. Look at the system in this way. Try to look at your second house lord, see what house it's falling into, and then look for videos like KRS does great stuff. You know, he's doing a whole series right now where you can find your house lords falling into another house. I'm going to be doing that eventually, but for now I'll plug KRS because he's done good work on it. You know, if you are a Sagittarius rising and your Saturn falls into any of these signs, if you have the second lord, Saturn, falling into the first house of Sagittarius, then look up the second lord in the first house. If Saturn falls in Capricorn, look up the second lord in the second house. If you have Saturn falling into the third house and you're a Sagittarius rising, then look up the second lord falling into the third house. Look up Saturn falling into the fourth house if you've got Saturn in Pisces and you're a Sagittarius rising. And you could do this for all of the rising signs. You know, just for the heck of it, let's do Leo rising. If you've got Saturn rules the 6th and the 7th house, especially if you've got important things happening in that 7th house. You know, if you've got your Atmakarka there, if you've got your nodes there, it's going to say a lot when you look at the 7th lord falling into whatever sign it's falling into. So you take the 7th lord or the 6th lord, whichever house you want to explore inside yourself. And you'd say, I have the 6th house lord falling into, I don't know, let's say Taurus. For Leo, that's the 10th house. So you'd have the 6th lord falling in the 10th house. You could also look at the 7th lord falling in the 10th house. If you have Saturn falling into Scorpio, then you could say the 6th lord is falling into the 4th house. Look it up, you know, take your time and do your best with exploring how this can expand your astrology. You know, it even gets more interesting when you find that you have a stellium and you really want to find out how that stellium is doing. In this case, we have 3 planets for Alan Watts falling into the 2nd house. So how that second lord is doing and what can be expected from it can really, you can learn a lot about all three of these planets and the second house by finding out which house is Saturn falling into and how is its lord doing. You know, it's especially relevant to this chart because Alan Watts was Saturn Atmakarika. That's more Vedic astrology stuff, you know. You want to know how the seventh lord is, how the Atmakarika Saturn is doing. You're going to look up how the lord of its house is doing, and that's Mercury. So really, that's an easy read. I'm going to have to do an Alan Watts chart at some point because there's a lot there. I digress. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I'm Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology. This has been our video discussing the whole sign houses. Let me know what you think in the comments. Explore, experiment. I'm loving doing this because I'm just really into astrology. So this is a technique that you guys can experiment with. Come to me, comment, email me. If you want to email me, you can email me at astrology@dustincormier.net. You can do a chart reading with me, or you can just chat with me to discuss how I would do your chart. See if it gets you any openings, any aha moments. Because if you're an astrologer like me, you're into just trying techniques. Particularly, I am most interested in seeing things the most ancient way. This is how things were done thousands of years ago, according to the books we have available and according to the evidence that we have available. If you think it was just because they were primitive, try it for yourself before. That's all I'm trying to say in this video. Try what I've just described to you before you put it away as the old, useless way of doing things. Then include your house cusps in there. See how you can integrate them. The thing is that you're missing out on this huge chunk of astrology by not applying what I've just described to you. This is how the ancients did it. Don't believe me? Try it for yourself. See what you think. Because astrology, after all, this is why we say astrology is a science. People who are not into astrology, they can call it whatever they wish. But you and I know, as astrologers, that the only way to really know a technique works is to try it, is to experiment with it, to explore it, see if it works. I dare you, I challenge you. Let me know how it goes. I love doing this with you folks. I'm Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology. Keep your eyes on the skies and let me know how it goes. I'm in touch.